All right, with that, it's 8:02 Pacific right now. We've got 30 participants. So I think we've got critical mass. Let's get started. My name's Sean Hughes. I'm from ServiceNow. If you didn't notice, I'll be your host today. I'm delighted to have Leandro Bonvera from Hugging Face and Harm de Vries from ServiceNow, who are our panelists and leads for this project, and will be kicking us off. So over to you, Leandro.
Actually, Harm.
Actually, Harm.
I'll take it from here. Thanks a lot, Sean, and yeah, welcome everyone. We're very excited to talk about this project to you today. As Sean mentioned, my name is Harm de Vries. I'm a research scientist at ServiceNow, and yeah, let's talk about BigCode today. So just let's start with sort of like a quick reminder that sort of the mission of our project is really the open and responsible research and development of large language models for code. So there has been like a lot of work in the research community and also like at big tech companies on working on language models for code. But some of them have been not quite open and transparent on to what actually goes into these models and what makes them work and what not. And so like the mission of BigCode is really to be open and transparent on this development, and we sort of like welcome the community to contribute to this project specifically. Next slide. Great. So we run this sort of like project through so for a core team of members. So like we just want to make sure that this project moves forward at a reasonable speed and that we make progress towards our goals. And to this end, we have like a couple of folks from ServiceNow Research and Hugging Face that make sure that this project carries forward. So specifically, so myself, Harm de Vries, but there's also like Raymond Lee, Dennis Kosetskov, and Sean Hughes, who are like from ServiceNow, making sure that that sort of like that BigCode makes progress on its goals. And Leandro?
Sure. My name is Leandro Bonvera. I'm a machine learning engineer in the open source team at Hugging Face. On our side, it's essentially me and Lubna Benalal who are running BigCode. Lubna started as an intern like half a year ago and is joining Hugging Face now full time to work on BigCode. And in addition, we also have Thomas Wolf, who's like the chief science officer and co-founder of Hugging Face, helping us running BigCode smoothly. And on the bottom right, you can see a picture of all of us last week when we did like the official launch. We were in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, and also in Amsterdam, and we took a boat ride together.
Great. So that was last week. Yeah, that was last week. So when we launched last week, we were really overwhelmed with the response from the community. So last week we onboarded over 200 people, and well, we did some analysis on like where everyone is coming from, and here you can see like sort of like a map of the participants, the countries of the participants, and you can see like it's really a global effort now. Like a majority is in the US, but there's a good presence in Europe, some in Asia, Africa, South America, and even Australia. So we're really glad to see that we're really trying to do this project on a global scale. Next slide. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, we launched last week, September 26th. Just a reminder that we'll try to operate this project based on like 6-month cycles, just to make sure that that we have like clear goals and sort of like deliverables. And so we are expecting to like finish the first phase in March. So what's coming up soon is like we'll be releasing a data set for basically a large code data set. We'll talk about that more later in this presentation. And also like a little bit later down the line, we start training like a larger model. And yeah, we'll also talk more about that later. Great, yeah, so to make this all happen, to sort of like make sure that all the collaborators from all these different institutes, so even from companies and from universities, can collaborate, we've put a lot of effort into establishing a legal framework. And I just want to sort of like go over it quickly with everyone here, so we make sure we're all on the same page. So for all the code that well, basically that's incoming code contributions from you or other collaborators, this should be made under an Apache 2.0 license. And at the same time, any code that we'll make available will also be under an Apache 2.0 license. So that's for code like for data analysis or for training models, et cetera. Documentation, we will make this available under Creative Commons license. So it's all like, I should just mention that these are all open licenses, right? So like these allow you to distribute and so like use it for whatever way you want to use this. And then for the machine learning models, we aim to work on a open and responsible AI license. So this has been pushed by our collaborators at Hugging Face that so like it's an open and permissive license for releasing model weights and AI models, but there are some restrictions on the sort of like behavioral use of these models. So like basically it's saying like that you can only use it for ethical use cases and want to sort of like exclude sort of like the use of these models for particular use cases. And I can also mention here that we are working on sort of like updating this version, this open and responsible AI license for specifically a code sort of like code generation model. And I will talk a little bit more about that later, but that's one part where we can definitely use some help and where we hope to have contributions from the community. And lastly, so the data sets. So this is like, well, it's a tricky discussion. So we want to be open and transparent about the training data, but of course, like there's also legal boundaries. So we need to have the rights to distribute data. So we just want to sort of have an open discussion around this and also discuss how we're going to manage data governance of these of training data of LLMs. So I think we expect to sort of innovate even in this area, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do a better job on how we manage this kind of data. Next, yeah. Okay, and then lastly, I just want to remind everyone that that there's a code of conduct. So we want to create like a healthy online community, and there are certain sort of like expectations for how you should behave in this community. I'm not going to go over all the details, but I'm just going to refer you to the code of conduct on our website if you want to learn more about that. Yeah.
Cool. And at that point, I take over, I guess. So a few practical things to just make sure things run smoothly. First of all, I think it would be great if all of you could add like a profile picture and add your job title and institute. The profile picture, at least for me, I'm horrible with names. So if at least there's a picture of somebody, there's some chance that I recognize people again. I might forget names much quicker than that. So I find profile pictures very useful. And also adding the job title and institute is just like helpful to know who you're actually talking to. When it comes to like Slack etiquette, we try to use Slack as the main communication channel. And since there are now like 200 people in some Slack channels, it can become like very noisy if everybody types messages like in the main channel. And so what we usually try to do is use threads as much as possible. So if somebody asks a question or something or has a comment and you want to reply to that, don't do that like in the main channel, but start a thread and communicate in threads. That makes it a little bit easier to navigate. Slack with that many users. Then we saw like a lot of people already ask how to contribute. We tried to set up a little list at the beginning in Slack of like various issues and so on where you can contribute. And I just want to reiterate here a little bit. We're going to use GitHub for like all the code, and we created like a project board, and I'm gonna show it to you live, just as an example of how that looks like. We have organized it a bit in to do, in progress, on hold, and done. And the most interesting ones are either the ones in progress or to do, if you want to look for things where you can help out. And we try to add good tags to all the issues. So for example, one issue we created is suggesting data sets that would be interesting to add to kind of a catalog. And if you go to one of these issues, you can see some information. And if you have some comments or you want to like take this issue, feel free to just add a comment here and then start contributing.
Leandro, just maybe a question on that. So if someone does take a look at this board and they see something they're interested in, can you just maybe spend a moment and talk through what does it mean to be a contributor and how you'd like them to go about it?
Sure. So I think the first thing you want to do essentially to make sure that like your work is not duplicated is just like making a comment on the issue saying like, I want to work on this, or I'm going to propose to do this. And then once you've done that, feel free to open a pull request solving a certain issue. I mean, that particular issue is not one that requires a pull request. It's more like gathering some information about important data sets. But for example, if there's one about setting up a new filter for the data set, you can just start opening a pull request on the appropriate repository. And on that end, I wanted to show you the full project. So that's the BigCode organization on GitHub. And you can see there are already like a few repositories here. Admin is mainly a place where we put like organization issues. There's not any code in there at this point. And the website just includes like the code for the website. So that's also not that interesting. The main two ones that are currently interesting is the evaluation harness I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and the analysis repo, where we have a lot of notebooks and analysis on the data set, for example. And if you're working on an issue on one of these repositories, for example, also on the evaluation repositories, Lupna has created a few good first issues. For example, you want to add like prompt examples for APPS. You can go to that issue, say, I want to take part in this, and then you can start working on it and open a pull request. Usually it's a good idea to open pull requests early so people can see that you're working on it and maybe can give early feedback. You don't need to wait until everything is perfectly polished. And in my experience, usually creating even a work in progress pull request is better than waiting a few weeks until everything's ready. Yeah, so that's it for like contributing on GitHub. Then, so GitHub is the main place for your code. The second place where we have a lot of information is the Hugging Face Hub, which is the primary place where we add data sets and models. And there's also an organization on the Hugging Face Hub that you can see here. I tried to add all the people that are in the Slack channel. If something didn't quite work out, there were a few typos and a few names, so I think I might have missed like a few people. Just ping me with your username on Slack and I'll add you. And you can see here there's models on the one hand and data sets on the other hand. And we also started creating like a table of content that summarizes a little bit like the different data sets and models that are already available. One thing I already want to point out is that most of these data sets and models at this point are private. We haven't released these things yet. You can all see them, but please also don't share them before we make them public. We want to release them once like everything's ready together. So that's that. Let me go back. One thing for data sets also, and for models, if you upload a data set or a model, please add model cards. If you have issues with that, feel free again to ping somebody from Hugging Face, either Lubna or me. We can help you setting up READMEs for models and data set cards. It's essentially just going to the model and clicking edit model card, and then you can start adding markdown. Specifically for data sets, there's that template I linked here, where you can see how such a data set card can be structured. And that will help like collaborating too, since we're adding like a lot of data sets. If we just name them data set 1, data set 2, and we don't add any more information on the READMEs, we're gonna get lost like pretty quickly. So that should help a lot collaborating, but then also once we are ready to release them, such that other people know what's in these data sets. We added a few like practical things, like as a contribution guide. The main theme here is like be proactive. I think now there are like 200 people in Slack that want to contribute, and I think there's sometimes a risk that if there are too many people around, that you just wait for an opportunity, and you think maybe somebody else going to start some task or project, and you can just hop on. But I think it's important to be proactive. So if something interests you, just go to the issue, open a PR. If you have time and you want to contribute, but you don't know exactly what, you can also like message me or ping me, and I can maybe point you to some issues that would be useful if somebody worked on them. We want to avoid as much as possible that like we lose the momentum, and it's just like a lot of people hanging around, not really knowing what's going on and what they could do. Yeah, so the first 2 points I already mentioned: open issues and new issues if you have ideas or tasks that you think are important, open PRs. All the repositories are public, so you can just go there and open as many PRs as you want. I mentioned that you shouldn't share like the private models yet publicly and data sets. And you also all have like write access. So please also don't delete any models and data sets that are already there. I mean, we have copies of them, but it's going to get very annoying if suddenly like models start to disappear and we need to re-add them. I also mentioned model and data set cards, and another important point is like outreach. So if you want to talk about something, write a blog post or tweet about something that's in the works, please coordinate a little bit with me and Harm and Sean. We're not like the outreach police, but we want to have this like a little bit coordinated, such that when we want to make maybe a big data set release, that it happens like at the same time, and not the interesting parts aren't spilled like too early. We have also compute. If you have a task and you need some compute, be it for like pre-processing or training models, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but just like ask me or Harm about that, and we can see what we can do to give you access. So talking about compute, we have some compute available and secured. So ServiceNow Research, it has a cluster of roughly 200 V100 GPUs that we can use. In addition, they, as well as Hugging Face, have cloud credits such that we can do other tasks like, for example, pre-processing that maybe require slightly different machines on the cloud. That being said, like we have enough compute, we think, to run the main experiments that we're planning to run. At the same time, if there's somebody who has access to like significant compute, maybe on a similar scale, that would be willing to contribute some of that to the project, we would be very interested to talking to them. If we have more compute, we can run more experiments, and we can extend a little bit the scope of the project. But at the same time, the compute that we currently have is sufficient to like train the kind of models that we were aiming for. So what's the plan? I talked a little bit about organization and how to approach a project. But what are we actually want to do in the next 6 months? Harm already teased it a bit, and he's going to talk a little bit more in detail about the data set. So there's a pretty big GitHub data set in the works that we're ready to share pretty soon. We want to work quite a bit like on data governance as well. So we want to make sure the data set that we release only has permissive licenses such that the data set can be easily shared and other models trained on, and then these models can also be used for example, commercial applications. We want to redact personal identifiable information, and we're currently investigating an opt-out scheme for the training set. So if somebody says, I have a repository and I don't want anybody to train their language model of that repository because I feel like strongly that that's me and I don't want like these people reusing that, we're currently working on a scheme for that. One very important aspect I find is evaluation. I find evaluation is like a very underdeveloped domain for code generation. If you compare evaluation for like natural language models, they're like, if you look at the evaluation harness that's used to evaluate those, there are like dozens of data sets with thousands of examples to evaluate them on. Whereas like, if you look at code papers currently, like most of the papers focus on like human eval and maybe 1 or 2 other data sets. But people would be pretty upset if like GPT-3 only evaluated on like 2 or 3 small data sets. So we want to extend the evaluation a bit by adding more data sets to the evaluation. That's like the goal of that evaluation harness. And also extending the currently very Python-centric evaluation to other programming languages. So these are like the 2 main goals on the evaluation front. Then once we are happy with like the data set, we're ready to start training, and we have like a good idea how we want to evaluate the model. We actually want to train a model with those 200 V100s. The goal is at the moment to aim for something between 10 and 20 billion parameters. That's pretty similar to Codex and CodeGen. But we don't want to just like take a GPT-2 model and train it. We also want to think a little bit harder about the architecture. So one of the main challenges of code models is like inference time, for example. If you want to deploy them in a editor, you need to make sure that you can run inference very fast. And therefore, we want to, for example, investigate a bit if things like multi-query attention, which is supposed to speed up text generation quite a bit, if that's something that's feasible and gives us like the gains that we hope for. Also looking at how to embed code best, we think about alibi embeddings or rotary embeddings, also thinking about infilling objectives. So if you have any ideas or experience, for example, with multi-query attention, we would be very interested in having your feedback. And then, as I already hinted a bit, inference is pretty important. And not only when we choose the architecture, but also once we train the model, we want to make sure that that model that we trained, that we can squeeze like the most performance out of it by optimizing the inference speed. And as I mentioned before, like multi-query attention should also help on that domain, hopefully. So I'm handing back to Harm, who's going to talk a little bit more about the data set that we have been working on for quite a while, and that we hopefully can release like pretty soon.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Leandro. Yeah, so just want to give a short sneak peek on like how on the sort of like the data set we collected, and you'll soon have access to. In fact, I think it's already on the hub, the permissive license version, so you can actually start exploring if you're interested in it. Yeah, so how did we collect this large data set? So we started with basically scraping the repository's name from like GitHub Archive. So GitHub Archive is trying to make basically like archive sort of like the public GitHub timeline. So we could like use like they sort of like release all these like event archives that we can just download, and we just extracted all the GitHub repositories from the last 5 years that hadn't had any activities. So just for, you should sort of like appreciate the sheer skill of this operation. Like we scraped like the number of unique repositories was like over 220 million repositories. So when we started downloading this on a distributed cluster, like an in-house cluster, we actually ended up with 137 million repositories. So as you can see, some of them might have been deleted, or somebody moved it from public to private. So there's quite a number of repositories that we lost along the way there. So then let's talk about the files. Like we downloaded more than 50 billion, we have more than 50 billion files in the repositories, but a lot of them are actually duplicates, like mostly for clones and whatever. So we ended up with 5 billion unique files. And even from those files, like a lot of them we didn't store, like a lot of binary files we immediately discarded. So we ended up with, if you just discard that part of the data set, you, in an uncompressed way, you end up with over 90 terabytes of data. From those 90 terabytes, we did some filtering, or selected, we only selected programming languages as extensions. And sort of like, if you just do that, we ended up with 27 terabytes of data. So I'll talk about like which programming language we selected here. It's around 30 that we first selected. It's like 27 terabyte. If you then look at that subset of data that is only permissively licensed, you end up with 3 terabytes of data. So, and this is the version, the 3 terabytes of data, that's not what we're going to release, because that's what we have permission to distribute. Great. Next slide. So,
just to mention, we've got 2 or 3 good questions relating to data sets off the back of what you and Leandro just presented. Maybe just pause for a second, and I don't know if you want to address those live in the chat quickly.
Maybe you can, like, which one are you specifically thinking of?
So there's questions around for the evaluation data set. Do you think we'll have to craft the data set ourselves, like human eval Excel?
Oh, I see. Do you want me to answer it, or you want Leandro? You want to take it? Well, I'll take it.
Sure, I can take. Yeah, go for it.
Well, yeah. So I guess like we're like, there were like people who have contributed like a version of human eval, right? That has been poured into, I think, like 18 languages. So I think that's like something I was not aware of, and that's something that already came out of like starting BigCode, and that's already been contributed. So I think that's kind of like a real nice asset that makes it much easier to evaluate like text to code in a multilingual setting. So yeah, but like, of course, I think we would like to see other tasks extended to other languages, right? So I think Leandro mentioned the evaluation suite is quite sparse for code modeling. So I think a lot of work can be done there. And was there another question? Or maybe Leandro wants to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one thing that we can add is like, we potentially can create like our own data set, but that also depends a bit like if there's like interest of people actually doing that, and also what the upside would be, or like the gain compared to like existing data sets. but I think we haven't settled yet where to go there. The other question was, any ideas for training graph neural networks on the code's abstract syntax trees instead of treating everything as text?
Want me to take it? Well, it's not something we immediately are thinking of. Like, I mean, we've been looking a little bit into like tree sitter, so parsing like the language, like basically the languages, the code data into abstract syntax trees. But even there, like not everything is supported so well, I think. So there, it feels like a lot of work needs to be done there before you can execute this idea. But happy to chat more offline if people are really interested in this direction. And
yeah, I guess we can continue and then answer the rest at the end.
Later. Right. So yeah, about license detection, real quick. We use a particular Go license detector to run this on the repository level. And I should mention that, well, let me not go into all the details here. It's actually like how we specifically specify if a file is part of the permissive license data set or not. It's like available. You can see this here in the slides later. I do want to mention that we hand classified sort of like a number of licenses from the output of the license detector as like permissive or not. So right now there's like the list is on the slides, but there's a lot more. I think there's over 400 licenses in there that's detected, and if there are people with legal expertise and want to help us out to classify more of those licenses, we can actually release a larger data set later. So yeah, if you have any if you want to help with this, would be really appreciated.
Oops.
Great. Oh, this one. Yeah. So here's a quick overview of a breakdown of the amount of data that we have per programming language. So this is actually for the permissive license data set. I mean, a few things that we can pick out here is that HTML is a large chunk of the data. There's a lot of Java, JavaScript, Markdown, PHP, some Python. But you can see like there's like these languages usually, like the other languages usually dominate the data set. So here we list actually the 30 extensions that we release, but we can actually get other programming languages as well if there's a lot of interest for it. Like it's not a hard thing for us to sort of like add more later. So if you have something in mind, like just reach out to us and we could include that in the data set as well. Right, so, okay, we're gonna switch a little bit to, we have done some experiments on our data set. So far, already found some interesting results. So we've mostly done our experiments on the Python subset of the data. So if you look back to the old license data set, so that contains basically all the files we scraped, that's around 680 gigabytes large. If you then go to the permissive license version, it's back down to 190 gigabytes of Python data. And we then also looked at removing near duplicates from the data set. And then you can see that for the old license version, this goes back down to roughly 252 gigabytes. And for the permissive license version, it goes down all the way to 74 gigabytes. So you can see that you lose a lot. You can actually lose a lot of data if you go from old license to sort of permissive license plus near duplicated. But yeah, let's look at, so we did some sort of, we did some experiments on these 4 versions of the Python subset. And specifically, we trained a 345 million parameter transformer model. It was a decoder only model, trained with the usual hyperparameters. I mean, I can specify more details later, for people who are interested in that, but I think it's more interesting to look at the results here. We evaluated here on human eval, and in the top rows we show the results from we base the results from Codex and Cogen from the similar sized models. So you can see the ballpark is roughly 36 pass at 100. And when we started our exploration with the data set, we for the whole license version, we sort of immediately reproduced that if we didn't do any filtering, so no near duplication. But then we went to the safe license or the permissive license version, and that's where we got stuck, around 27% pass at 100. And we had a hard time cranking this up to 36 again. We tried pre-training on natural language, pre-training on other languages, but that didn't even help. The one thing that really helped here was using near duplication. So that boosts us back up to 37% pass at 100. So it is kind of interesting that you can get you can sort of get the performance of Codex and Cogen on a permissive license data set if you do the right data processing. And maybe another interesting thing to note here is that we also tried training the same model on the code parry data set that Leandro and Lubna has been working on for a while. So that was just that data set was taken from BigQuery, but it's a bit smaller, and you see it doesn't get you all the way up to the same performance, even with near duplication. And then the final thing I want to show from this table is that if we use the Python all license version with near duplication, you do get really strong performance. It really outperforms the Codex and Cogen version with almost 8%, 8 points on a similar size model. Great. So these are, I think, quite interesting results. You show the data set is quite interesting and can get you really promising results. Of course, we need to see what happens on a larger scale, but we've done some exploration already. Great. Right. So a few other things, so the data set will come out hopefully in a couple of weeks, the next few weeks. One thing we want to experiment with is giving sort of code creators or developers the possibility to opt out of the training set. So specifically, there could be a lot of work that needs to go into how we're going to manage this exactly, on how we're going to opt out, and how we potentially retrain models if we if you can. We can imagine that we would say hey, here you opt out of the training set. For the next version, we're going to retrain, your data is not included. So there's going to be a real sort of management, data management around that. But just to get started on this, we will start just putting up a Google form where people can just submit their email address that they've used for the Git commits or the GitHub handle, and we'll find a way to verify if they're the real owners of that account, and then we'll sort of start exploring that. So it's a lot of open questions there, but we're really excited to sort of see if we can get this to work in practice. Yeah, Leandro.
Cool. I guess that's where I'm going to take over again. So we listed a little bit the tasks that we see at hand that we could use help with, belonging to some of the working groups that we've set up. And let me just go through the list a little bit and explaining what these mean. Redacting PII, that's a thing I mentioned earlier already. We want to make sure that the language model is not trained on data that contains passwords or hashes or SSH hashes or something like that, keys. So we want to filter the data set in that regard. Near deduplication means the work Harm has just talked about. We now manage to deduplicate even the large data set. with near deduplication. But we want to explore also a little bit more how we can do that more systematically, knowing like what's the right setting for near deduplication. At this point, it was like one shot, essentially. We near deduplicated and it worked out great, but maybe there's like even more room for improvement. Tokenization is like an important topic. What's the best way to tokenize code that it's efficient and usable? I mentioned the evaluation harness that Lubna has been working a lot on. That's essentially a tool that should enable anybody to evaluate their language model for code on like a bunch of benchmarks and get the results back without needing to like program a lot. So there are like a handful of tasks in the evaluation harness right now, but there are like a lot of open issues to make the harness a little bit more general and also like including more tasks. Harm mentioned the OpenRay license. That's ongoing work. There's an existing OpenRay license, but probably for code, we want to adapt it a little bit with like other risks that are more substantial when you have language models for code than if you have language models for natural text. Then there are like a number of architectural questions that we mentioned earlier, like infilling is one thing, multi-query attention, but there are also questions about like, should you really go for a decoder or is maybe an encoded decoder better? And any help and insights on that end are very welcome. So far, we've done some experiments with filtering based on like similar filters that Codex use that essentially look at like the average and maximum line length and a few other things. But we've also done like some preliminary experiments with CodeParrot where we looked at like removing, for example, a little bit of tests or configs from the data set, which also showed a little bit of improvement. And maybe there are other content-based filtering methods that are important.
So let me add one thing there, Leandro, and that's
Sure.
like the content-based filtering, right? Like that was very Python specific and that worked quite well for Python, but we found it was like filtering out a lot of data for other languages and we're not quite sure it was the right thing to do. So I think just people want to explore that, right? Like what's a reasonable content-based filter, rule-based filter that can filter out some useless data there would be
yeah. Maybe to give one example is like what people do for Python is they remove every file that has a maximum line length that's more than 1,000 characters, and it turned out like for HTML that seemed to like filter out a lot of data. So probably other filters are necessary for these kind of languages. I think I can skip the opting out part. Harm just talked about it. Then like some folks from Stack Overflow joined BigCode and we're really excited helping them getting some data sets in the open such that people can train on them. I think they have like a lot of like very interesting data, like questions and answers and code snippets and everything connected to each other. So we want to work a little bit on getting that to the hub, for example, and then also think a bit about how we can use that maybe for model training. There are a number of questions about more data from GitHub. So there's like a lot of data in GitHub issues and pull requests. The licensing around that data is a little bit less clear than for the code itself, where you have like a very clear license if there's one, but like what the license is for the issues is less clear. And also like getting more metadata from GitHub would be interesting, such as like GitHub stars or how many other repositories use a certain repository, like forks, these kind of things that could help like making useful filters to get like an even more high quality data set. Also, as I mentioned, we want to make like good data set cards, especially for the data set that we released, the main one, to make sure like that everything's well documented and people can use the data set in a responsible way. There are a number of questions around security. One thing is, do we want to remove, for example, malware from the data set? We've uploaded a few data sets with code previously, like Code Parrot or GitHub Code, and the Hugging Face Hub security filter flagged all those data sets for having malware, and we never really had the chance to look deeper into it. But I think for this particular training, it would be interesting to see like if we can find those files and remove them. Another question is sandboxing the evaluation. Currently, we're mostly running evaluation on throwaway machines on GCP, for example. But it would be good if we had like a better way how people could also evaluate models maybe on their local machines or their local cluster without needing to worry too much about like malicious code being executed. And then finally, one thing that we started working on that's like pretty much on the top of the list right now is getting a scientific plan out. So I mentioned like several ideas that we have and a rough plan that I lined out earlier, but we want to like structure that a little bit more in terms of like scientific questions we want to answer and experiments that we need to run to answer those questions. So that scientific plan is hopefully we can release like a draft in the next few weeks, and that should guide like the whole effort a little bit better. Anything you want to add on the scientific plan, Harm?
Not really. Maybe Sean wants to say something about dataset cards, or is that worth sharing?
Yeah, I think on the dataset cards, as Leandro mentioned, just in the spirit of responsible AI and transparency, we want to make sure that we're not chasing later on, trying to figure out, what are the sources of data. So we really would appreciate, if you're going to submit and propose a data set and you've taken the effort to curate it and present it to the project, please do use the standard template that is available on Hugging Face. That'll save us a lot of time down the line. It'll also help with the evaluation, and it just helps to increase the overall credibility of the work we're all doing.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe the last thing to mention is about the working groups, how they're currently like set up. I mean, the ones that we created, working groups are the channels starting with WG, are essentially the working groups that we know that we need and that we want to do in any case, and that we could also like kind of chair ourselves if needed. But if you're like interested in other working groups or you want to chair one of the existing ones, we'd be interested in that, and you can reach out to us and tell us if you have like time and interest to do so. I think if neither Sean or Harm want to add anything to that, we can discuss like the questions a bit more. Oops.
Well, maybe let me add one more thing, that even if you're sort of like, oh, say like a couple of people reached out to me saying like, oh, I have time for a couple of months to work on some issues, like, and I just don't know what I want to work on. Feel free to reach out to me or Leandro. Like I said, there are a lot of tasks going on, right? And where we could use some help. So don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Perfect, thanks.
Awesome.
Leandro, do you want to just start working through the open questions in the Q&A from the top?
Yeah, let me do that. So the first one is from Chris about like meetings. Like Chris really excited about having more meetings. If there's going to be like regular scheduled meetings, the way I imagine it going is that maybe like these like kind of all hands meetings is something that we can do from time to time when there's like something to talk about, maybe some milestone or some new things. I'd imagine like for other things, we're going to organize things a little bit more within those working groups and see how many meetings are needed there. but I don't think we have a fixed plan yet.
Yeah, I think in the spirit of what you said earlier is, meetings for meeting's sake doesn't make sense. If there's something that it would be more effective and efficient to be handled in a meeting, we have the Slack groups. Let's use those channels as a way to, try and work through issues. But if it needs a meeting, someone should just feel free to say, folks, I think this is going to work better if we can just get some time on the phone together, do a Zoom chat or something, and set it up from there ad hoc as needed. But then, as Leandro said, from a project perspective, really it'll be more kind of milestone driven when there's something to actually, share from an all hands perspective.
Cool. The next question.
Let me add to that. We're also planning to actually do some in-person events. Like, we are still figuring this out, right? But now COVID is over. We might sort of like have some, BigCode day co-locating with some conference, or but we'll still have to figure this out. But we would like to also have some in-person events if possible. Yeah.
Thanks. The next question is, are there stats of trained data set available somewhere? Also, is the official small subset to play around with? So about the stats, there's pretty much what Harm has showed so far in the slides, and we can share the slides. I think quite soon we can add a little bit more data. I think we're still collecting the stats actually for some of the subsets. In terms of availability, you can go to BigCode, and the big data set, like the safe license without new duplication, is that one here, BigCode multi-safe license raw. And you can see here, these are all these languages that Harm mentioned. And if you go in there, you see JSON-L formatted files. And if you want, you could just download one of those. You can use the data set with the datasets library, which should make your life much easier. So you can load the dataset with that code. And if you go here, there are two things that I can provide that will make life a little more easy. So if you do that, it will download 3 terabytes of data, which maybe you don't want to do on your laptop. But there are 2 features that we can use. One is you can select the subfolder. So you can just select one of the languages that you want to load, or just one of the files that you want to load. And the other feature that's really cool is streaming. So if you add a keyword here that says streaming equals true, instead of loading the whole data set, you will get like an iterator type object, and you can iterate over samples without ever downloading the whole data set. And so there's no like small subset yet that you can play with. I plan to do something like that pretty soon, but in the meantime, that's like an easy way to access the data set without needing to download everything. I'll post the necessary snippets in Slack, so you can start playing with the data. The next question is, what type of near deduplication is being done in these experiments? Is this LSH, minhash, or something else? So yeah, so far we've been using minhash near deduplication, but we're also looking at like other methods. We have Chen Gao, who's like kind of a near deduplication expert, who's been like doing some experiments, and we're going to see like if there's a better way to do it, and maybe in a more efficient way. Maybe the next question is for you, Harm. What sort of metadata is available for every row in the data set?
Let me see, like what, let me see, like, do you mean, can you go back to the table, or do you mean like in general for, like, maybe Chris can clarify what he means by every row in the data set?
I guess like what kind of information? Go ahead, Chris.
So I've actually, Chris, your microphone should work now if you want to speak.
Right. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesomeness. So the data set that Leandro just showed us, on the Hugging Face Hub, if I were to load this, every row would potentially be like the text of the file and some metadata, I would assume.
That is right. Like I don't like, I think we have the format. I mean, I can't tell you on the top of my head what exactly is in there, but like it's like I can definitely look that up for you and send it to you.
Thank you very
like
much.
obviously there's just the file. There is I think there's license information. There is there's like a way to track this back to a repository, but it's a little bit it requires you to join to do like a slightly complicated, no, not complicated join, but you have to join with some other data to get the exact repository back. But we'll provide more details on like how to do this if you're interested in that.
Thank you, Harm.
Perfect.
The next question is, sorry, what sort of, if near deduplication gives such a lot of gain, what are some of the other ideas for pre-processing that has not done before? So Nathan suggested like filtering by GitHub stars. That has been done. I think the subset of the pile does some of GitHub data does some filtering based on stars, if I remember correctly. So I think doing something like that would be interesting if we can get the necessary metadata. It's pretty tricky to get it through the GitHub API because you're rate limited. So we can, I think, get the information of 1,000 repositories an hour, and we need like 100 million. So it's going to take a while. So one idea is to reach out to GitHub maybe to get some help getting that information. Some other things that I've briefly mentioned that Lubna has been looking into is like, those are kind of like language specific filters. But for example, in Python, you can quite easily detect if a file is just unit tests by just counting how many times tests comes up in a file, and you could like just subsample the test files a little bit. So not removing them totally, but just making sure you don't have like 50% tests if that's maybe not the thing you're that interested in. Similar for config files, there's a lot of, in Python, there's a lot of like config files that are just like variable assignments. And maybe you want to remove some of those. Lubna has been looking at like how often is the assignment operator being used, and if there's even a for loop or an if else in a file, and if not, then maybe it's not such an interesting file with regards to like human eval, because there's like more about like lead coding.
Right, so we're at top of the hour. Maybe answer the most high priority one, and then we can wrap it up.
Sure. Maybe one related to the data set is, will the data sets and models get published in a journal? You want to take that one?
Sure. Well, I mean, we're still like we're actually writing the paper right now. We'll definitely put it in archive first, and we'll see if there's a like appropriate venue for this kind of work. We have not decided, I guess, on that yet.
Another one is around like, aren't pull requests part of the cloned repo as branches? I think that's true. I think that refers to the comment I made about like issues and PRs being a little bit more delicate. I think it's true for the code, but like for the text that's on the PR, I think it's a little bit less clear. I think Harm has a little bit thought more about that, right?
I mean, there's like also like different branches, right? Like we actually just use the main branch and store. I mean, we throw away a lot of metadata just to save storage, and we keep the commit idea, right? So if people, so we can later make updates to the repo by pulling again if necessary. But for the moment, we just have the sort of main branch that was checked out at that point in time.
Yeah. Maybe one last question that we can take. Actually, we can probably answer both. It's like, what data sets will go under the BigCode Hugging Face organization? Should it only be like novel data sets, or all the data sets, if I understand correctly, that are used in the project? I think in general, we don't want to like duplicate data sets on the hub. So if there's a data set already available, we can just use it. We can use the BigCode organization on the one hand to add like novel data sets that don't exist at all yet, like the GitHub data set, and also to add data sets from places that are not on the hub yet. I think those would be like good uses of the hub. And then the last question that's open, how were tabs, white space tokens, and new lines handled in the data sets, if any treatment was applied? You want to take that?
Yeah, exactly. We experiment with two things, but like two tokenizers. One where we added like these white spaces and new lines, as I think was mentioned in a couple of papers. We also trained like a new tokenizer from scratch on combination of like code and language data. So I think we tried both. I don't think we find a lot of differences in results between them, but Raymond Lee can actually provide more information and details on that. So if you're interested in that, I would suggest to discuss that offline on Slack.
Terrific. I think it wraps up today's session. I don't know if there's any closing remarks from yourself, Leandro or Harm.
No,
just that I'm really excited about getting started with the project. As you saw on the timeline, it took us like quite a while to get here, and I'm super excited to have like 200 people also excited about building a language model for code together.
Same thing, like just really excited we got here and looking forward to working with everyone.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Let's keep the discussion going in Slack and in the working groups. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.